Good evening, everybody. If you turn to Matthew 27. Tonight I want to do a character study. And the character that I want to put before you is Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate, there are probably more written about him than most characters in the Bible, certainly in the New Testament. And one of the few stories, if you will, or situations that's mentioned in every one of the New Testament books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And what I want to do is I first want to go through those stories as quickly as I can, and because each one of them has sort of a different perspective on what Pontius Pilate was, who he was, what his situation was. Because if you think about, Pontius Pilate was living life, happy governor, living his life, doing what he does, and then all of a sudden one day his world gets turned upside down. All of a sudden he is face to face with Jesus Christ, and all the world has to say about him, and he can't avoid that. He can't get around it. He tries. He tries to do to like a hot potato, get rid of this guy and get on with his life. But it's not to be. God puts his finger on Pontius Pilate and pushes really hard, and you'll see kind of what happens and what that reveals. In Matthew 27, beginning in verse 1, it says, when the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Now they have a problem. Just take a little side note. There's no death penalty that they can enforce, like we have here in some countries. They just don't allow the death penalty. And to the Jews, this heresy deserved death, and they wanted Pontius Pilate to mete out that punishment. So they take him to Pontius Pilate. Pick up in verse 11, because I skip over this part about Judas. He's not our focus. In verse 11, and Jesus stood before the governor, that's Pontius Pilate, and the governor asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus said unto him, Thou sayest. And when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then said Pilate unto him, Hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee? And he answered him to never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. Now at the feast, the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner whom they would. And they had then a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas, or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. That the Pharisees were envying Jesus. He knew this was bogus from the get-go. This was trumped up charges. All they wanted to do was maintain their position and influence in the community, and Jesus was upsetting that. Pilate knew this was nothing real. Verse 19, and when he was set down on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, Whether of the twain will ye that I release unto you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate saith unto them, What shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? They all say unto him, Let him be crucified. And the governor said, Why, what evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, Let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. And then released he Barabbas unto them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall, gathered him unto him the whole band of soldiers, and they stripped him and put on him a scarlet robe. And when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Let's jump over to Mark. A lot of reading here, but I think you're going to be glad that we did. Mark 15. Now, keep in mind, as you're reading this, that the way they're trying to get Jesus crucified, the first order of business is going to be on sedition. And what sedition is you're trying to overthrow the government. So they want to pin on him, and that's why Pilate says, "Are you saying you're the king of the Jews? You're a king? You're another ruler? You want to take over and lead these people? Again, we have a king, but you're trying to establish something inside of the country. That's sedition." And so if they can pin sedition on him, then they've got what they want, politically, and they can say, well, okay, this guy deserves to die. He's a rebel. He's a rebel. So Mark 15, verse 1, "And straightway in the morning the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, Art thou king of the Jews? And he answering said unto them, Thou sayest it. And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, Answerest thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witness against thee. But Jesus yet answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled." Now, if I can interject here, if you go to Isaiah 54, if we keep your finger where it is, we're coming back. The silence of Jesus, if you didn't know, was prophesied long, long ago in the Old Testament. Now, I've got a different Bible than I normally have here, but I think Isaiah 53. In verse 7, speaking of the Christ to come, of 53, it says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth." He opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. So we know that this Christ standing before them, all the accusations of the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and now Pilate speaks nary a word. In fact, it said before, when all the Pharisees were accusing him and they were bringing different people in with different accusations, all the accusations were conflicting. And it would have never stood up in a court of law, because one would say one thing and it would be contradicted by another. And they had nothing, from a legal perspective. But that doesn't stop them. And back into Mark, if you would. Verse 6, "Now at the feast, that's Pilate, released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them. But Pilate answered them, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. But the chief priests moved the people that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. And Pilate answering and said again unto them, What will you then that I shall do unto him? Ye call the King of the Jews. And they cried out again, Crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, Why? What evil has he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, Crucify him. And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them, and delivered Jesus, when he had scourged him, to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole band. And then they clothed him with purple and platted the crown of thorns and put it on his head, and so on and so forth. Let's go to Luke 23. We're going to start getting some differences here now with Luke 23 and John 18. in Luke 23 in verse 1, and the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the King. Now, see, they're bringing that in because this is the only way they're going to move Pilate to do what they want him to do, and that is he's forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. Of course, that's a lie, saying that he's Christ the King. And Pilate asked him, saying, Art thou King of the Jews? And Jesus answered him and said, Thou sayest it. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. And they were the more fierce, saying, He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. Now when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent unto him unto Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And the Herod with his men of war set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. And the same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. And Pilate, when he had called together for the chief priests and the rulers of the people, he said unto them, You have brought this man unto me as one that perverts the people, and behold, I have examined him before you, have found no fault in this man touching these things whereof ye accuse him, nor yet Herod. For I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. For of necessity he must release one unto them at the feast. And they cried out all at once, saying, Away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas, who for a certain sedition made in the city, and for murder was cast into prison. Pilate therefore, willing to release Jesus, spake again to them. But they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. And he said unto them a third time, Why, what evil has he done? I found no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him, and let him go. And they were instant with loud voices, requiring that he might be crucified. And the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed. And Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. And he released unto them him that for sedition and murder was cast into prison, whom they had desired, but he delivered Jesus to their will. Now, there's one other place. I'll just make a note. You might make a note of this in Luke. We don't need to go there, but Pilate gets mentioned again because Josephus comes and begs the body of Jesus, and Pilate acquiesces to that. And then finally, and the last one, and then we'll kind of take a whole bunch of things. I want you to see these things, though, because, for example, he was quite happy when he heard this, he were a Galilean. Quite happy. Why? Because the hot potatoes off his plate. I don't want to deal with this guy. I don't want nothing to do with this. And I can kill two birds with one stone. I can make Herod happy because he wants to see him. And I can make myself happy because now I'm out of this. And it's not my problem anymore. So he was quite happy to send him to Herod, but it didn't work out quite the way that he wanted. Let's turn to John 18. And you can see 3 times he tried to get Jesus off the hook here. 3 times. He says, I find no fault. I find no fault. John 18, in verse 28, they said, then, and this is the one where you get more into what Jesus says to Pilate. This is the one where later on we're going to see in Timothy, there's a verse that says, I gave thee charge in the sight of God who quickens all things, and before Christ Jesus, who before Pontius Pilate witnessed a good confession. We'll go back to that verse, but what it's saying, and Paul was saying later on, is Jesus gave to Pilate a good confession of the truth. And so this is where you're going to see more of Jesus speaking to Pilate about the truth. Verse 28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early. And they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out unto them, Now, they're too holy to come in where their judgment might take place, lest they should be defiled. Pilate then went unto them and said, What accusation bring ye against this man? They answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him unto thee. Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, Art thou the King of the Jews? Jesus answered him, saying, Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and chief priests have delivered thee unto me, and what hast thou done? What hast thou done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou a king then? Jesus answered, Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate saith unto him, What is truth? What is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews, and saith unto them, I find in him no fault at all. And when he had said this, they went out, But ye have a custom that I should release unto you one at the Passover. Will ye therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews? Then cried they all again, saying, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Now there could be another sermon on how Barabbas represents every lost sinner, and how he was released because Christ took the punishment. We won't go there tonight. Chapter 19. But Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe, and said, Hail, King of the Jews, and they smote him with their hands. Pilate therefore went forth again, and saith unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that you may know that I find no fault at all in him. That's a funny way to show I find no fault in him. He just had him beat to a pulp. But so it is. Then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate saith unto them, Behold the man. When the chief priests therefore and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went out again into the judgment hall, and saith unto Jesus, Whence art thou? But Jesus gave him no answer. Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have the power to crucify thee, and I have power to release thee? Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. And from henceforth Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaks against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that's called the Pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was in the preparation of the Passover in about the 6th hour. And he saith unto the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priest answered, We have no king but Caesar. They lie so much, it's hard to even absorb what liars these people are. They hated Caesar. Then delivered he him therefore unto them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away. And he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him, and two other with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the midst. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This title then read many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city, and it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin, the languages of the world. Then said the chief priests of the Jews to Pilate, Write not the King of the Jews, but that he said, I'm the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I've written, I've written. I'm done with you people. I'm done with you people. I wrote what I wrote. So, first of all, just in terms of just the general background, marvel at this. The Son of God chose to stand before earthly tribunal, that you might be free in a heavenly tribunal. And so, don't miss the basic significance and the importance of that. That Christ, humbled himself to be put into judgment by these people. Obviously, he stood there innocent, and he, an innocent man, taking upon himself the punishment, sitting under the judgment of man, that you might be set free. And that's a huge, huge thing. He stood like a lamb before the slaughter, as it said in Isaiah 53, that we might, he was silent that we might cry, Abba, Father. And so don't miss the big point. But with regard to Pilate, a couple of things. I got about 6 things or 7 points I want to make, and I want you to understand that in a sense, Pilate represents every man. Pilate represents you. Pilate represents me. Pilate represents everything that's human. And note number 1, that Pilate has a religious streak. And you might not notice it, but in John 19 it said he went out of the judgment hall to meet the Jews. They couldn't come in there because of their religious thing about they didn't want to defile themselves for Passover. So he kowtowed to their religious need. Okay, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to meet with them. So Pilate understands the religious part of things. In my mind, he's slavishly defers to it. Okay, rather than saying, if they can't come in, you can't come in. There's no business being done today. But no, he wants to keep them happy. And so he goes out to them and finds out they want an innocent man killed, and they don't want to get their hands dirty. They want him to do the killing. Okay, he knows that. He says in Matthew 27, he says, for he knew for envy they had delivered him. He knew this was a trumped up charge from the get-go. And he was to be their device by which they were going to kill the Christ. So Pilate he doesn't have any illusions. He's not fooled by this. He's not fooled by this at all. He sees the hypocrisy, but still he goes forward anyway. That's point number 1. Second, Pilate is obviously more concerned about satisfying those that he needs to keep his own situation and in life, keep his own privileges in life, to keep his, he's the governor, he wants to stay the governor, he wants to be somebody, he wants to be, he doesn't want to lose his status in life. Okay, and so it says in Mark 15, it's in verse 15, it says Pilate was willing to content the people. He wanted to make them happy. And in John 18, and take a look at this in John 18, verse 34, Jesus points out to him something important. And you have to keep in mind that when you're reading a question from Jesus, and when Jesus is asking a question, you always have to say to yourself, Jesus knows the answer. Why is he asking the question? He's asking the question to make Pilate see something, to make Pilate confront something about himself. And that thing that he wants Pilate to confront, he says, Pilate says, art thou king of the Jews? And he asks him this question, do you say this thing of yourself, or did others tell it thee of me? And what he's saying here is, are you making a serious inquiry? Do you have a personal interest in this? Is there something you want to know, Pilate? Are you asking me about something, a question that I can answer that will be of benefit to your soul, or are you just asking because they told you to do this thing? And now Christ knows, but Pilate has to face this now. Pilate has to face the fact that, well, actually, Jesus, I don't really care. I really don't care. And so Pilate has to come to grips with, what it is that he's about. And what he's about, and we're going to see this again when Jesus speaks to him about his own power and so forth. But the point I want to make is Pilate's more concerned about taking care of those people and meeting their needs and keeping his position than he is to address. Here it is. This Jesus shows up on his doorstep. This same Jesus. Now, Herod knew it, and I'm sure Pilate knew it. Herod wanted to see him because he had done so many miracles. Pilate had to know about those miracles too. Here's a guy that comes in before him in judgment. He's raised the dead. He's walked on water. He's fed thousands with no food. He's healed the sick. And here he is on his doorstep. And people want him put to death. So Jesus makes it clear to Pilate that he doesn't really seem to have a personal interest in the truth at all. Not really. Not really. And that's a sad message for Pilate. He has to cut, and Pilate doesn't take it well. When he said, do you say this thing of yourself, or did others tell it of me? Pilate says, "Am I a Jew?" You can just see the disgust. Like, why are you asking me a question like that for? You're getting religious with me. I don't want to be. I don't want to deal with religion. I don't want to deal with what you've been saying or preaching or anything else. I'm not a Jew. So get it out of my world. Point number 3, Pilate thinks he has power over Jesus. And this is in John 19 and verse 10. Pilate says, why aren't you speaking me? Don't you know I have power to crucify thee? I have power to release thee. Jesus corrects him. You could have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore, he that delivered unto me has the greater sin. Now, most people are just like Pilate. They think they have power over Christ. They think they have power over Christ. They think that if I do this thing, Jesus must do this other thing. Why? Because I have power over him. Or if I make this decision or do this prayer, then Jesus must do this or that. Jesus tells Pilate, you could have no power. You have no power. You have no power. That's not given to you by God. And the power that that's it. So he also, by the way, where he says, "He that delivered me has the greater sin." I've read quite a few things on this, and I think probably there's a couple different ways to interpret, but probably the one that makes the most sense is that what Jesus is saying here is that these people are perverting that, the court system. They're perverting that which is good. A way to resolve disputes, a way to manage a society through lawful judgment. And he said the Jews have decided that they're going to commit murder through something that was otherwise good. And so there's other ways to interpret it, but that's the point is that it's not really an issue between him and Pilate, but he's saying, these others know that they're using that which is good for evil purposes, and therefore they're guiltier. Point number 4 is that Pilate refuses to engage with Christ over the truth of the gospel. Pilate doesn't want to hear it. He plugs his ears and don't go here. Jesus says to him, or Pilate says, "Are you a king?" And Jesus says, "You say that I am. To this end was I born, and for this cause I came into the world, that I shall bear witness to the truth. Everyone of the truth hears my voice." Rather than Pilate, here's the very God of heaven and earth sitting there. He's raised the dead. He's healed the blind. He's made the lame to walk. He's walked on water. He's fed thousands with nothing. And he says, "Everyone that's of the truth hears my voice." You would think he would have a question. Tell me about this truth you're talking about. I need to understand what this is. But Pilate doesn't want to go there. But here's his great opportunity, his grand opportunity to inquire about what the truth is. And yet, again, arrogance of man. What's truth? There's no truth. Everybody has their own truth. And I was thinking about this. And what if Christ were to show up on your doorstep and you had to render a judgment? Um, in what ways would it differ from the way this is the way the world responds to that? It basically says, listen, I'm busy now. Can we have this discussion later? Jesus, I know you're a good guy, but I really don't want to have anything to do with you. Or by his response, by what is true. I'm not going here, Jesus. I know you want to talk about heavenly things. I don't want to go there for a lot of reasons. And people are like that in the world today. They're going to say, your timing is bad. I want to live my life the way I want to live it right now. Later on, maybe we can get together and we can talk about truth. But right now, I'm doing my thing. Or you could say, Jesus, religion is so confusing. What is truth? Why are we getting all hung up on this? Everybody has a truth. Why are we going here? So people respond to Jesus. Many people respond to Jesus just like Pilate did. And they really want to keep this distance between themselves and Christ. Even though they know who he is, they know what he's done. It's like, I do not want the persecution of the world. I do not want all that you're going to bring with me. He's trying to have it both ways. He wants to be for Jesus. Like, well, I find no fault in him. I'm reminded of one of my favorite bands. I can play it on my guitar. Jesus is just all right by me. Jesus is all right. I don't want to be against him, but I don't want to be for him, because being for him is going to create a lot of problems for me. And that's where Pilate's at. I'm not against him, but I'm not for him. And at the end of the day, where does he go? Take him and crucify him. If it comes down to me or Jesus, I'm going to make my pick, and it's going to be me over Jesus. So Pilate wants it both ways. He wants to be okay with Jesus. He definitely wants this issue to go away, but it won't. God has ordained to reveal to Pilate and the world exactly where he's at and his condition. Many today claim to be a Christian, but they don't want to be tossed in this bucket, Bible reading, church going zealots or anything of that nature. Pilate wants to on the one hand, recognize the fact that there's no fault in Christ at all, and on the other hand, he wants the world more than he wants Christ. He wants the world more than he wants Christ, and God is going to make it on this day for Pilate where there's no way around. He can't defer it. He can't delay it. He can't give the decision to somebody else. It's right in front of him. But there's a slippery slope that begins in Pilate's damnation of Christ. First he says, I find no fault in him. Then he says, I find no fault, but I'll chastise him. Then he says, I find no fault, and you're to blame. He blames others for what he does and how he has to reject Christ. And so he does that in a couple different ways. Washes his hands. It's like, I don't, I'm gonna wash my hands of this. It's not I'm innocent of the blood of this just person. But he finally says, take ye him and crucify him. I find no fault in him. And I've never heard a judge in my life ever say something like that. I find no fault in him, but go ahead and kill him. And Pilate would have been extremely happy if he could have blamed somebody else for the choice he had to make. I use the choice advisedly here. I mean, from a practical human perspective, Pilate has to make decisions. He's a judge. He has to say guilty, innocent, do this, do that. That's what he's got to do. And now this is all under the sovereign hand of God, as is in Isaiah 53. This is the lamb. The lamb had to go to the shearer and take upon himself the punishment for all men. But he wanted to blame somebody else. And so as soon as he knew that Jesus would belong to Herod's jurisdiction, wow, I mean, that was like, okay, I am off the hook. I don't have to decide about Jesus. I can continue to do my thing and not be bothered by anybody. And that didn't work out for him. But I thought about that. I said, men like to blame other things for their rejection of Jesus. It's human nature. I don't reject Jesus. It's just, the preacher, I don't like the preacher. He's got bad breath, or, I can't take that. They look for other things. It's my family. My family doesn't like this, or my family doesn't like that, or it's my spouse, or my, they won't do this and they won't do that, and therefore, I would believe otherwise, but I can't because of these problems. And so Pilate was looking for that out, and he thought Herod was going to be the out, but it wasn't. And so he's a lot like Judas in the sense that after he rejects Christ, he can't find any comfort. He still knows his own guilt. He still knows his own guilt about this. Judas, after he had betrayed Christ, went back and threw the silver back in the temple and said, I want to undo all this. I want to undo all this. But there was no undoing it. And there was no undoing it for Pilate either. He tried to get Christ released, but in the end, his final judgment was in Luke 23:24, and Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. It was Pilate's determination that he was going to stand opposed to Christ and say with his finger, put him to death. It's better that he be put to death than all the loss and all the suffering that would be brought on me if I should side with Christ. He wasn't going to go there. And it's kind of funny, and it's a little bit sad for Pilate, because in the end, I think the religion wore him out. My experience is false religion does wear people out. If you stay around and you live as long as I do, people who are involved in false religion early, they flame out at some point. They flame out, they lose the emotion, they lose the zeal. They're no longer, it just doesn't do anything for them anymore. And I give you, and Pilate, after he had gave instructions to crucify Christ and put the sign on the top, King of the Jews, and they said, don't say that, don't say that. He said he's King of the Jews. Pilate said, what I've written, I've written. I'm tired of you people. I'm tired of this whole thing. It's just none of this works. None of this works at all. But by then, his fate was sealed, you might say. So here's the conclusion of all this. I know there's a lot of different things here, but Jesus is going to visit you and me at a time and a place that we didn't expect. I'm sure that Pilate was having a wonderful breakfast when all this happened. And all of a sudden, everything that was not in his life before, it's now on his plate. And he can't get rid of that plate. He would love to do that. And so it is in the lives of men. When the gospel is going to come to them in a time and a place that they don't expect. And once it's there, it's there. It's there. And so it says that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. And all of a sudden, this is a big problem. This is dynamite that's set on their plate. Now, there's what Pilate did. To turn to Matthew 15, I've got 2 verses to look at as we close out here. Pilate could have gone another direction with this. But he had no heart to it. He had no heart to go any other direction than what he did. In Matthew 15, okay. Well, I'm sure Matthew 15 is a really good story, but it's not the story I was looking for. Okay. Let me just tell you about that. There was a woman of Canaan, and Jesus was going by, and her daughter was grievously vexed with the devil, and she threw herself at Jesus' foot. And Jesus said, "What have I to do with you, lady?" And she said, help me with my daughter. And Jesus said, it's not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to dogs. And she answered, truth, Lord, yet the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table. Pilate could have responded in this way. Pilate could have said, tell me about this truth you're talking about. Pilate could have said, he saw that he was innocent. He knew that he was innocent. He could have inquired. He could have had his soul's needs met. but he had no interest. He had no interest whatsoever. But there are so many examples in the scripture of those that were also challenged. Christ challenged them. I mean, this woman was, her daughter grievously vexed, and she had a great need. And Jesus basically said, "What am I to do with you? I'm not doing. You don't cast the children's bread and give it to dogs, even if it means puppies. It's still he offended her, if you will. So it's it's better to be a beggar at the feast than the king in a kingdom of dirt. And what Pilate is a king and a governor in the kingdom of dirt, rather than to be a beggar at the feast. And so in Pilate we see this bad example, if you will, and it's one of the saddest stories in all of Scripture. The very God himself came and ministered the truth to Pilate. There he was. Imagine that. Just imagine that. That very God himself was sitting at the seat right in front of Pilate, telling him the truth, and he cared not. He cared not. Pilate was more focused on what are others going to think, what's in it for me, how will this affect me, what will I lose? And he didn't want the gospel to upend what he wanted. He wanted to be in control of religion and in control of Christ, not controlled by him. Pastor Warner used to say, men like to patsy around with the gospel. Pilate was tinkering around, nibbling around the edges of things. But in the end, he gave sentence that it should be as the religious zealots wanted, that Christ should be put to death. And Christ he wanted him out of his life. And that's where he ended up. But men think, like Pilate, think that they can control Christ and control religion in their life. Jesus said, men should pick up their cross and follow him daily. Jesus said, if your love for your brother, your mother, your sister, your family is greater than your love for me, you're not worthy of me. And so, but men prefer, they don't like that. They want to control their life. They want to control religion. They want to control Christ. They want to put Christ in a box, and here's my religious part. Bill Clinton, as president, was famous for compartmentalizing things. It's like, okay, his life had lots of little boxes, and he had a place for relationships with different people. And Jesus the Christ will not be put in that box. And Pilate wanted him in a box. Here's my religious life, right here. And it didn't work. But men think they can control Christ, and when Christ comes to them and confronts them about themselves and about what they believe, things don't end up well. And it didn't matter, by the way, that his family member, didn't matter that his wife said, "Hey, leave this guy, this just man alone. I'm tormented about this." And then Christ's questions show that Pilate had his deep problem and his deep need, but he still, at the end of the day, he would not have this Christ to reign over him. He needed Christ to be underneath his thumb, not bothering his life, everything else being the way he wanted it to be. And so in closing, turn to 1 Timothy 6:13. Closing. Ran a little long tonight. Paul said about this whole thing, let's begin in verse 12. It says, "Fight the good fight of faith, lay hold on eternal life, whereunto thou art also called, and hast professed a good profession before many witnesses." This is 1 Timothy 6, verse 12. Verse 13, "I give thee charge in the sight of God, who quickens all things, and before Christ Jesus, who before Pontius Pilate witnessed a good confession, that thou keep this commandment without spot, unrebukable until the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ." What he's saying is that Pontius Pilate witnessed Christ's confession of the truth to him. Christ revealed the truth to him right there. And Pilate continued on his way. Jesus told him he's a king. Jesus told him he came into the world to bear witness to the truth. Jesus told him his kingdom was spiritual. Jesus told him he had servants who would fight, but he's not of this world. Jesus told him that those of the truth hear his voice. It did not matter to Pilate. It did not matter to Pilate. And I'm reminded of the story of the man that was sitting in hell, and he said, "Go back and tell my brothers that I don't want them to come here to hell. Come to hell. Send someone back from the dead and warn them." And Abraham said, "If they won't hear the scripture, someone coming back from the dead is not going to make any difference to them." And so with Pilate, it's kind of the same thing. Here he had very God telling him the truth, and it mattered not. And so it is. It's much better to be like the woman of Canaan. When Christ ends up on your doorstep and these things are in your life, pray that God give you grace to be more like the woman of Canaan and say, "Truth, Lord, but the puppies eat the crumbs that are off the table." It's much better to be at the feet of Christ and saying and worshiping him and speaking of this truth than to have all the other things of the world that Pilate desired, wanted, craved, wouldn't do without, wanted religion to be his subject to all his whims. It's far better that Christ rule and reign in each and every heart of every believer, and he will. And he will.